First of all, it's really cool to see how this whole conference has evolved. We were at the very first one back in 2015, right after the first year we got started back in 2014, and I swear the whole conference was basically the first two tables, which has nobody at them. So it's really cool to see how this whole industry has evolved from that time. And that's what this presentation is going to be about today. It's going to be about how over the years, this technology has become more mature, and thereby the challenges that we face as you start to move from not just pilot to implementation, but implementation to a global rollout comes with its own set of challenges beyond just figuring out the right use case. So a little bit about Apprentice before we dive into all the learnings we took away from one of the case studies that we have at one of our top pharma companies. We focus specifically on a AR and AI solution for life sciences. We are a vertical solution specifically for this space, and we've tailored something to the pains and the regulatory compliance and all of the challenges associated with organizations in life sciences. So the largest pharma companies in the world, biotechs, research organizations. At this stage now, we work with over half of the top 25 largest companies in this space, in addition to a bunch of other medium and smaller biotechs, contract manufacturers, et cetera. The really fascinating thing, though, about pharma is that it's a very, very diverse industry when it comes to the types of drugs that are produced, the methods in which they actually get out to market, and the ways in which the individuals working in this space have to actually contend with things on a day-to-day basis. And so that's my background. I come from this space. My team comes from this space. We're located in New Jersey. For those of you that know a little bit about New Jersey, we still like to think it's the pharma capital of the world, but that's known at least more than just the Jersey Shore. There's a lot of pharma in our state. But the really interesting thing, though, is that because we had the luxury of focusing just on a single vertical, over the years, we've gone through some really fascinating challenges from initial pilot stage, which I think this conference is great for because there's a ton of learnings and sharings around use cases and how do you get started and what are the best ways in which we can leverage this technology. To then, once you get past the pilot, you start to ask yourself, okay, I'm going to be moving this into my day-to-day operations. This is what my team will be using to run their process. And so there's a lot of challenges that get associated with moving just from kind of a test and learn phase to really full-blown day-to-day operationalization. And then when you take that full day-to-day operationalization and try to do that at a global scale within an organization, well, there's some interesting challenges there as well. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And the kind of the learnings that we took away from this experience with one of our customers in particular. But diving in a little bit more into what do we do, just a quick slide about what we do in particular. Within life sciences, drugs are made in batches. As a point of comparison, there really isn't like a classic assembly line in our space. So this is not like a Tesla facility. Is there anyone from Tesla here? No, okay, but it's not like a Tesla facility where they have a really long assembly line. Drugs are made in batches over time. And it's a really interesting component for how manufacturing gets done in this space because you have this component of time. In biologics in particular, cells are actually grown up and they multiply in these big bioreactors. And some batches can take up to months from when the first sample comes out of the freezer all the way on through to when it's packaged, put in a carton, and then put on a truck to get out the door. And so what we've done in particular is we don't just do work instructions or like guided maintenance. We used to do that back in, say, like 2015, 2016, actually even part of 2017. But what we've pivoted towards is that in order for you to be successful in a space like pharma, you have to run the whole batch. And this is where it now has ballooned into a system that is the end-to-end process. And I think that's why we've started to become successful in deploying at scale is because AR and XR, if it's just only focused on a small, narrow use case, which, for example, very popular. We love it. We've done it a million times with our customers. We've probably heard things like changeover and line clearance, which are great places to get started. But if you really start to think about how can this technology provide value at scale, it has to own the whole process. And in our case, that's the batch. And so we've built what we call an augmented batch record system around this whole concept. We also obviously do work instructions because we have that as well. But really our focus is around the actual batch itself and the procedures that govern how that batch gets out to market. Subsequently, we have a solution that is around global collaboration like many of the companies here today do. But our solution is specifically tailored to the compliance requirements and the clean room requirements, which we'll get to in a moment, of this space itself as well. And then, of course, we're big fans of hands-free because this is something that, it's been talked about many times before at this conference, is an enabling factor to get an organization to use this technology to, again, in our case, get an entire batch out the door. And so to now finally dig into how does this all work, yes, we start with a pilot, very similar to how other organizations do it. But what we really focus on, though, is around that batch. And we look at it holistically from end to end to see how this technology can run the drug campaign from the start to the finish. And so we typically focus in that area on the use case side of things, but also in the first couple days, telepresence is always that thing that resonates with these organizations, especially organizations that have a global footprint. The case study that we're going to talk about, they're coming up now in 90 locations around the world, and so collaborating globally at scale is a big challenge. But once it moves from pilot to that first implementation, there's a new set of challenges beyond just choosing the right use case. Because if you choose the right use case, great, you prove out the initial value of this tech, but you really need to figure out how do you then move this into day-to-day operations. And so for us in our world, environmental is a big deal because there's different grades of clean rooms in our space. GXP compliance, because we are working in regulated environments. We're making drugs, and so it's a fully regulated process from end to end. So GXP, for those of you that don't know, there's a whole subset of regulations around good laboratory practices, good manufacturing practices, et cetera. And so our whole solution has had to be tailored and comply with all of these regulations in this space. Subsequently, everything around security, IT, et cetera, these are really important concepts. But then once you move towards expansion, though, and you're deploying now globally, not just one site, but many, you have to take into account some other interesting things with this technology for most often infrastructure, like the last speaker was talking about at Raytheon, where they don't want a cloud solution. So our solution has had to be flexible to work both in a cloud as a SaaS offering, but also as an on-prem offering as well. So having kind of a hybrid solution is really critical if you want to deploy into really complex environments. But language support is actually one of those things that we found to be really interesting and challenging in and of itself, because when you have deployments in multiple countries in Asia, South America, and across Europe, people want to use RealWare in the language that they want to use it in, for example. RealWare, when you press and hold that little button, it comes up with all these different languages. But if your app isn't ready to handle those languages, well, then in and of itself doesn't provide enough value. So we'll get into a lot more of the expansion components, but we're going to be focusing on the rest of this talk, not on pilot and use case, because that's, I think a lot of other speakers have been exceptional there. We're going to be focusing on the implementation and expansion component. And so when you're moving from pilot to implementation, one of the biggest things that we've had to focus on is bridging this gap from what we call like episodic uses, which during the pilot, it's being used during fits and starts, where it's kind of being used to prove out the value, demonstrate the potential. But when you move it to actual implementation, it's got to be the day-to-day operational use. And that's where the right use case comes in, which is, in our case, well, the batch is the day-to-day process. So everything associated with that batch is what they're doing on a day-to-day basis going forward now. There's a lot of use cases. I know I mentioned earlier line clearance and changeover, for example. But these are moments where line clearance happens, at least in our world, maybe every once a week, every couple of days. It's not enough where it gets into the day-to-day operations. And so when you start to think about that initial pilot use case, it's got to be focused on something that gets embedded into the day-to-day workflow of these teams that then are using this technology successfully. But it's not just the actual use case based on value. Habit is a big deal with this stuff. You're getting somebody to change from using, some instances for us, paper, to go to a very digital and sophisticated system. And there's a habit change there. And so choosing the right initial use cases to ensure that the habit change is as small as possible is also a really important concept. But the biggest component for moving from pilot to implementation is enterprise, and in our case, regulatory readiness. Because if you choose a solution partner that is not ready to work with your enterprise IT, your enterprise security team, in our case, quality and regulatory teams, it will end up getting stuck in this phase where there's not enough seriousness that's applied to the actual technology. And it's just like, oh, well, this is kind of a cool emerging tech. We'll come back to it once it's mature. So the level of dedication that our customers spend to the enterprise readiness in their pilots are just as high as what they spend on the use case. Because once it gets time for when that pilot converts over to implementation, having all that stuff ready and together and set became a critical component of our success that we've baked into our project methodology. So when we start off a project, we focus specifically on not just the use case, but this enterprise and compliance readiness. Because the interesting thing about pharma is, like I mentioned, is that the software that's used in this space, you can't just go and deploy it. It has to be validated. And for those of you that are in industry and have gone through the validation process before, it's incredibly long, complicated, and frankly painful. So even though we have an AR solution, emerging tech, et cetera, we've built in compliance and this whole concept of validation from the start. And it's not just the compliance aspect that we've spent a lot of time on. We've made proprietary enhancements, both removing components and adding components to the devices such that they can be used, in our case, in different clean rooms. So within drug making, there's different types of clean rooms that people use, to make drugs. And so there's like a grade D environment up to something called grade A, and it spans the gamut of just using like a classic lab coat that you guys think about when you maybe think of drug making, all the way up to a full-blown head-to-toe bunny suit where there's multiple layers of gowning that you wear, which is a really harsh and difficult environment. And so the requirements for the devices also have to be as stringent as what the requirements are for any other piece of equipment in this space. So we've made specific proprietary changes to the devices in order to get them to work. Because we focus on pharma, we made them specifically to this space. And I suspect that a bunch of you guys out there in the audience also have some challenging environments that maybe the device isn't perfect for at this time, but just know that it's completely possible to modify this device to be successful in whatever environment that you have. And so now once you go from pilot to implementation, deploying this now at scale comes with its own unique set of challenges, which we took a lot of learnings from with one of our customers who is now in 15 countries around the world, not just sites, countries around the world. And so some of those challenges that we've run into is, first of all, just supporting this. Supporting this at scale and providing different tiers of support, whether it be for the devices themselves, the software, any other types of issues with configuration, et cetera. We've had to create a global footprint of resources in order to handle those types of interactions with our customers when they run into different types of situations. What we've noticed around support is that it kind of falls into a couple buckets. And I'm sure as you are starting to think about your teams and how you're going to be constructing and organizing support for this new tech, what we found is that there is device level support, which typically are things around like Wi-Fi connection, battery, in our case, clean room readiness, et cetera. Then there is the software support. So how do I actually, use the software with this new tech? And then lastly, it's all the configuration. And so what we've done is we've set up different levels of support and leveraged the resources of our customers in order to be most successful here. But support is a key component because when you're deploying many, many different types of devices in many, many different countries, being able to support that either from a central location or from a remote site is really critical. Subsequently, training needs to be baked into it. What we found is that different cultures, different countries require different bits of training. And so we've tailored our training program and have enabled our customers to train the trainer to be able to help out and ensure smooth kind of getting started process with this tech. But the infrastructure and local languages are actually probably what I'd say is the most work we've had to do as a company to be prepared to handle this type of implementation. And so we've set up our cloud-based infrastructure in multiple regions around the world. So we have global replication at scale so that if you access our site in Asia, for example, I literally just got back from China a day and a half ago, you'll be able to then hit our site in region and have all of our services be in region instead of, say, hitting our US East server if you're a pharma company in New Jersey. And so having that kind of global replication and low latency is really important because especially when you're making drugs, you don't want to have to wait for your software to load. And so as you guys are thinking about, how am I going to be growing out my XR, MR, whichever path you guys are going down, implementation, making sure that the infrastructure can be deployed globally is something to keep in mind as you're getting ready to move from pilot to deployment. And then the last bit of it that really, I think the devices have matured to a state to handle very well is local language support. So we've architected our application to be able to handle multiple different languages, and we developed a process around how do we introduce new languages into the system. Because there's something that's so cool about somebody, say, down in Brazil, putting a headset on and speaking Portuguese to a headset that they've never heard of or seen before, or somebody in Japan speaking Japanese to it, or in China, or in Germany, or in the Netherlands, and it's just something that becomes very magical about the system that we experience here in the States, because when you put this technology on for the first time, it feels magical, it feels really cool, but to do that in a local language is something that becomes very powerful. So just something to keep in mind as you guys are thinking about how do you roll this out in your organizations globally to multiple sites. Language is something I can guarantee you goes a much longer way than what it costs you. Because to translate your application into another language isn't too terribly expensive, but the ROI, the payoff on it, when you're deploying this and having people talk to these devices and getting feedback in their ear in a language of their choice is really, really cool. And so what we've also done, though, is we've recognized that when people are collaborating, now this is our collaboration tool, by the way, so we've talked a lot about our batch process, but we also have a classic telepresence tool as well. But for this tool, what we've done is we've baked in a lot of AR collaboration components because we recognize that sometimes it's hard to communicate effectively in different locations around the world. So if I'm in, say, California, and I'm interacting with somebody in Turkey, and the language that they speak, their first language that they speak is not English, being able to use AR tools and different types of annotations allow you to collaborate and communicate in what we call a language-independent way. Because you don't even need to really talk to folks if you have a tool set that allows you to point, direct, guide, and understand what it is that the two of you guys, or in our case, one-to-many, are working on. So not only did we care a lot about language like actual translation, but we took a purposeful tact in our application that when you're collaborating at scale globally, you want to have the tool sets to be able to be successful, even if you don't speak the language of the person that you are collaborating with. So to round it out, kind of at the last slide here, one of the largest pharma companies in the world, like I mentioned, has 90 sites around the world. We're in 15 countries with them now, so we've gone from pilot to implementation to initial expansion, and we're on our second tier expansion where now we are expanding now globally into multiple different regions. We've translated our application for them into 5 languages. We're actually working on our 6th right now. And it's been very successful. Like I said, there's something magical when you can talk to the device in the language of your choice. But because we came up with such a structured process around how do we actually roll this out, how do we do it at scale, et cetera, it really only took about 6 months to get each of these kind of sites up to speed. Because each site, they have to go through a validation process, and that's something we can't really get around. But you can do this fairly quickly if you have the groundwork in place. And so really for us, the key learnings here is starting off with having a solution that's very tailored to your vertical. That was a kind of a no-brainer for us, well, mostly because we focus on only one vertical. But in our case, the compliance aspect was kind of we like to say it's kind of like a pre-approved mortgage, where you can't even really talk to these organizations unless you have that compliance aspect associated with it. And so for us, we bake this into our product from day one. And so if you're in an industry that requires regulatory, or has, I should say, regulatory compliance requirements, that's really something that even before you begin the pilot, we believe you should take into account, because that combined with the enterprise readiness, whether it's IT, security, et cetera, will become a much larger issue as you start to scale out to these additional implementations. And then, like I mentioned, thinking very purposefully about how do you support these projects, how do you train people effectively, and then how do you support them in the language that they are most comfortable with, is something that even for an emerging tech like this, as you push down the maturity scale and you start to do deployments of larger sizes, is really something that becomes a critical component of success. And so things that you can do in the pilot or initial implementation stage to help that along will become much bigger, and you'll kind of thank yourself later on if you do that initially from the start. But with that, I just want to say really again, thank you. It's super cool to see how the industry has evolved through all these years. And if you guys have any questions, happy to answer them.
Hi, Gize Banyas with Johnson & Johnson. I'm dealing with grade B clean rooms, and one of the challenges we're faced with is sterilizing these devices to enter the clean room. Can you talk about some of the different methodologies your team has used to sterilize these devices? Have you done any type of testing with different gases, such as ethylene oxide, chloride dioxide, nitrogen dioxide? Additionally, you mentioned that you do proprietary altercations to the devices. How do you ensure that when you do these altercations, the devices still work? And also, does that void the warranty with the devices? Those are some questions I'd like some answers to. Thank you.
Sure. So I would say I'd break that into 3 components. The first component is the methodology for how do we introduce it into a customer's clean room environment. Then there's the methodology for what do we follow for actually, getting the devices ready. And then it's, how do we support those devices? And so I'll start with the support one, because that's kind of the easiest. Everything now goes through us. So we own these devices, we support these devices. We are the central source of both feedback, guidance, and issues when it comes to the devices. So we bear the brunt of the responsibility for how, or what I should say, happens to these devices in this environment. The second area is the methodology for how do we introduce it into a customer's environment, which is before we even get there, we have to provide a long set of documentation for the changes that we've made, the tests that we've done, and what we've had to do to ensure that it can meet the standards in especially a grade B environment. For those of you guys that don't know, grade B, pretty harsh. People are in full head-to-toe gowns, they have a mask on, safety glasses, head over hood. Frankly, it's a pretty harsh environment to work in on a day-to-day basis. And so in these environments, for the actual device itself, yes, we've made proprietary enhancements that are proprietary, but the methodology that we followed was we started with what are the requirements of these spaces for our customers, and then we kind of worked backwards from there. And so once we worked back from there, we looked at the device and we said, all right, where are the key areas that really need to be enhanced, or what are the key areas of the device that we need to remove? And so we went through a very structured process internally. And it wasn't just, by the way, for one device. We've actually been doing this concept since 2015, because the very first deployment we had, they said, well, how am I going to use it in a clean room? So we didn't have a choice back at that time. And so we followed a methodology where we worked backwards from the requirements of the space, made changes to the device, and then we conduct our own testing and our own set of documentation that we then provide back to the customer. And so we've not only gone through the testing that you've described, but we've also gone through testing in API areas, because for those of you guys that don't know pharma too well, there's two different types of drugs. One is a biologic, which is typically injected and is liquid-based, and the other is small molecule, like a pill that you take through your mouth orally. And when you're making pills, some of the API, which is active pharmaceutical ingredient, rooms can be explosive. And so, or I should say, require explosive proof ratings. So in those environments, not only did we have to contend with the clean room environment, but we also had to contend with the explosive proof ratings. And so, long story short, we broke it into a series of steps that we had to perform. We went through our own rigorous testing internally for the last few years, and then we made physical changes to the device that then we support as a vendor, well, because we made the changes to it. And so, happy to connect afterwards, because it's a really kind of fascinating concept. And if you guys are at J&J, you guys definitely know it. And so, yeah, happy to share more after the event. Anyone else? Great.